afternoon, everyone. This is Betsy Hill, President and Chief Operating Officer of the Brainware Company, and I want to welcome you all to our Neuroscience and Education webinar this afternoon on concussion and youth sports. We're very excited that you're all joining us today, and particularly excited to have a couple of really great guest speakers. Before we get started, I want to just do a couple of housekeeping things, one of which is that we are recording our webinar so that it can be accessed. We will post recording on our archive, usually probably early next week, so that you and colleagues who maybe can't attend today will be able to see it. Second of all, we'll be happy to circulate a copy of the slides that are being used for the presenters today. So you'll be receiving that shortly in the next couple of days probably. And I guess the last thing is that if you have questions during the webinar, we encourage you to ask questions by using the chat window, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a little box. You can send a message to the host, and that will be my colleague, Sarah Sawtelle, who will be tracking questions as we go along, and we will try to include as many of them as we can. So I think we're just about ready to get started. And what I want to do first of all is introduce our presenters this afternoon. Dan Nicholson, CEO of Headcase, and Jim Buskirk, who is president of Peak and Balance Centers of America. Dan first describes himself as a lifelong athlete, coach, and father of 3 young athletes. He still participates in football, skiing, hockey, boxing, and martial arts, and I'm impressed because my list isn't anywhere near that long. But he's had a number of experiences that contribute to his point of view and what he is passionate and involved in today. One of which is coaching football, youth hockey, baseball, and soccer for, I imagine, with his kids and many other kids, and has been in a position of having to take an athlete off the field after a hard hit. He is very involved in concussion awareness, concussion evaluation, the whole concept of playing safely in sports, and concerned particularly for the health of his children and frustrated by the lack of affordable concussion detection and evaluation options, he actually created the company Headcase. What he brings to that, in addition to his passion for sports and his concern for young people playing sports, is a wealth of experience in technology and data. He's worked for SPSS, Business Objects, SAP, and others, which are all about using data to make life better, and he's certainly trying to do that in this case. And his colleague, Jim Buskirk, is also has a wealth of experience as a physical therapist and as a certified sports specialist. He has worked, in addition to the Peak and Balance Centers, which are located around the country, has worked with the Department of Defense and NASA on projects of dizziness and balance. He does a lot of research in those areas. He's a graduate of the University of Health Sciences, the Chicago Medical School, and completed the musculoskeletal track in the master's degree physical therapy program at Northwestern University. Today, his primary research interest is in the recovery of function following concussion. So that is the point of view that he brings to us today. He works with a wide array of professional and college-level teams, including the Chicago Wolves professional hockey team, for whom he is the team physical therapist, the Northwestern University men's hockey team, the DePaul University men's hockey team, as well as his practice with individual patients. So I may have skipped something. If so, Dan and Jim, I hope you will feel free to share additional information. And what I will do is just welcome you today. So glad to have you here, and turn the presentation over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and be speaking with my colleague, Jim. So if you could forward the slides so we can start telling these kind folks about, or educating them and build awareness around what is a concussion. Betsy, if you would play that short video for us, that'd be great.
Yep. Sarah is doing that right as we speak. And
or jolt to the head, or by a hit to the body that causes your head and brain to move rapidly back and forth. This sudden movement can literally cause the brain to bounce around or twist in the skull, stretching and damaging the brain cells and creating chemical changes in the brain. What you might not know is that these chemical changes make the brain more sensitive to any increased stress or injury until it fully recovers.
Very telling. Thank you, Betsy. So I thought we'd start off by just kind of defining, what a concussion is. And unbeknownst to me, before I got into this field, I didn't realize a concussion actually was a traumatic brain injury. Playing or continuing to play with a brain injury is extremely dangerous. It's a lot more dangerous than, say, blowing your knee out and then continuing to play on a blown out knee. It's just a more hidden, silent injury, but vastly more dangerous. And it's caused by any significant impact to the head or skull can potentially cause brain damage or brain injury, which is typically diagnosed by a physician and or a trainer like Mr. Buzzkirk. But make no mistake, concussion is a traumatic brain injury. So if we could go to the next slide. Jim?
Say thank you for allowing me. Betsy, I'm sorry, this is Jim. I just want to say thank you for allowing me to participate in this. I didn't get a chance to do that at the beginning.
No, we're very happy to have you here, and I was trying to make sure you were unmuted, but everybody can hear you now, so.
All right, great.
That's great.
All right, so there are various parts of the brain anatomically that can be involved in a concussion, and various parts of the brain have various functions that can be altered in the presence of a concussion. So it depends upon which part of the brain is injured, can tell us what functions associated with that particular part of the brain may be involved. So this diagram shows the main structures or the main components of the brain itself and where the main systems are located for each one of those parts. And then depending on which part is injured, those functions can be altered. We have various tests that we can use to look at the various parts of the brain. And then compare those to functional findings or complaints that the person presents with to give us some indication of which parts of the brain need to be addressed.
So, Jim, for example, if an athlete gets hit in the front of the head versus the back of the head or the side of the head, what are those going to likely produce different kinds of symptoms or different kinds of issues? And could you just give us maybe an example or two of how those might be different?
Sure. Yes, you're absolutely correct. And it should be noted that the actual site of impact does not necessarily mandate what part of the brain is going to be involved, because oftentimes with contact type concussion, the brain will move about within the skull and often it's the impact that the brain and brain coverings have with the skull itself that can cause trauma. So not only a direct trauma, let's say, to the right side of the brain could cause damage to the right side of the brain. It may actually, because the brain sloshes over to the other side and impacts on the left-hand side, maybe that particular part gets injured. So just because one particular area of the brain is impacted doesn't mean that that part of it is going to be affected by that particular blow. So in the case that you cited, and that is if we find that it's the frontal lobe that becomes impacted, whether it be directly in the front or that particular part that gets moved, then those functions associated in the frontal lobe can be affected. A lot of times that involves mood changes. It involves some of the things listed here: motor planning, impulse control, and decision making, versus a different part of the brain where, for let's just say in the back of the brain or the occipital lobe, vision is the main function there. So the vision may be altered if in fact that particular part is altered. So what we tend to see in most cases is not just one localized area of the brain that becomes involved, but usually it's a myriad of all the various different functions that all are impacted by a concussive injury.
Certainly sounds that way if things would be, as you conveyed it, sloshing around. I hate to think of my brain sloshing around, but I suppose it might do that.
Sure, and I think it should be noted that concussion injury can be caused without any direct trauma to the head itself. It can be a body blow per se, or a violent whiplashing of the head where there's actually no physical contact to the head itself, but that whipping of the brain inside of the skull can cause a concussive injury. So you don't actually have to have head contact in order to get a concussion.
I think that's really helpful to realize, because sometimes when we see, and I think you've got a couple of examples in here where it doesn't look like a blow to the head, and you think, oh, why was that a concussion? But that would explain the fact that it's that whiplash effect or that something else that just really jolts so that the head moves rapidly and then the brain hits the inside of the skull.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we can advance to the next slide. So again, this is just an image study indicating up in the frontal lobe, in this case, on the right-hand side. It's always reversed in these scans, by the way. This is just you see that little white spot up in the front up there that would just indicate a white matter change that occurred in the frontal lobe of the right side of this particular brain. So we have various.
Maybe you could you explain white matter a little bit and why that would be?
Sure.
So what we're seeing here is actual cell level effects, right? We're saying among the neurons. Is that what we're looking at here?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a functional scan showing actual brain cell activity, and the various colors are showing how much brain activity is occurring here. And so in the case that's outlined here that's circled by that yellow circle, there's a white spot up there, meaning that part of it is not firing. Those brain cells have been injured.
So I think we can move on.
Yep.
So back to, traumatic brain injury statistics, if you will. The Center for Disease Control estimates that there's, 3.8 million concussions annually. And I believe that statistic came from 2013. So I think it's safe to say there were even more in 2014, as that has been a steady incline over the past years, even with better sporting equipment. The athletes are bigger, the surfaces are faster, and they're just hitting harder and stronger. Traumatic brain injury from sport is second only to car crashes, which a lot of people don't realize. But the majority of the concussions that happen are still from car crashes. But it's very close. This next statistic is actually is a bit off. High school football accounts for a large portion of sports concussions, but I think that 47% is incorrect, and I believe that's one of my stats, so my bad. But I believe that 47% of concussions are sport-related. I think that's what that stat was supposed to say, so my apologies. I think one of the most shocking things here on this slide is that 1 in 5 high school athletes will sustain a concussion this year, and 1 in 3 will have more than one. That's pretty shocking, and I don't think a lot of people realize that, especially that not all of them happen in football. We'll get to some slides later which will show that this is in every sport, not just the head hitting sports and helmet sports, but in every sport, concussion is an issue. Could you go to the next slide? And this is just more on concussion facts. And I believe, as Betsy had indicated, she's going to provide these slides for folks afterwards. And athletes in most every sport, as I mentioned earlier, are subject to concussion, soccer being one of the largest. Basketball, volleyball, lacrosse, wrestling, almost any sport where there's physical contact, there's going to be concussions with people, playing hard. This is also an incorrect, and again, I think this is one of my facts here. Someone who suffers a concussion is more likely to suffer a second concussion is true. However, second impact syndrome is a very debilitating, almost life-threatening, or is life-threatening syndrome that happens when someone plays with a concussion and gets another one. And it's a very, very serious syndrome. And it, like I mentioned, it can be life-threatening and usually is. So it's extremely important that if an athlete has a concussion, they are taken off the field of play immediately.
So, Jim and Dan, what I'm gathering from your description so far of what's happening during a concussion and statistics like these is that if an athlete has experienced a concussion, then their brain sounds like quite a bit more vulnerable at that stage, and that the risks then of not identifying and of continuing to expose the athlete to the potential for another damaging blow is even more, considerably more serious. So that damage makes the cellular damage that you talked about, Jim, actually makes the brain more vulnerable to subsequent problems.
Absolutely correct. And Dan clarified. Go ahead. No, and Dan clarified the slide here. The second impact syndrome is really the one that we all worry about in healthcare. The first impact syndrome, or the primary concussive syndrome, if managed properly, and that's what we're going to get to later on in the discussion here, generally will recover and not present with problems. The one that we really worry about is the athlete who returns back to participation and has a second impact or a second injury before the first one has fully recovered. And, this is what we worry about with anyone who's sustained a head injury, whereby if they're active playing in sports and they sustain an injury from a car crash, totally unrelated to the sport, we have to make sure that they don't return back to the sport where they could sustain a second one, and vice versa. We worry about people who've had an athletic-related injury getting a second one, even if they have been removed from their sport, so that we don't worry about them getting a second sport-related injury. We also have to make sure that they don't get a second injury from something other than their sport. Especially in the cold weather climates where there's a lot of ice and snow, someone who's had a head injury, we have to make sure that they don't slip and fall on the ice and hit their head again, because that could be catastrophic. So we always try to protect the injured person, whether it be an athlete or non-athlete. After that first head injury, they become much more susceptible to the second one, which can be much more catastrophic.
So I think coming up, we actually have an example of a hit in a professional football game.
Yeah, this was a very well-known hit, because the football player being hit is ex-49er quarterback Alex Smith, and he's being hit by Jolon Dunbar. This was in 2011, and it knocked Alex Smith out of the game for the rest of the season. And he actually ended up losing his job because of it. This was a very serious concussion. It looks like when it happened live, it just looked like a tackle, and it looked like he'd hurt his back or his butt from the way he got hit. But once they slowed the film down and looked at it, you can see he's getting hit very hard in, the rear temporal lobe, and he was knocked unconscious and missed the rest of the season and most of training camp. So this was like a 6-month injury to this high.
This seems like an example of what you said, is it doesn't have to be necessarily the blow to the head, because it looks from this picture as if he's just coming down on his butt, basically. But it was nonetheless, the brain was hitting against the skull inside.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and he experienced problems all across his brain. It wasn't just in the temporal or occipital lobe where he got hit. My understanding of this concussion, it was extremely severe. And these types of hits happen. I mean, especially in the back of the head where you cannot protect yourself. We were equipped with hands and arms to sort of brace our fall in the front and the side, where in the back we're extremely vulnerable. This is, an example or a chart regarding, 18-year-old and under, or actually 19-year-olds and under, the estimated number of TBIs per sport. And as you can see, football's up there, but so are a lot of other sports. One of the sports that's missing here is actually cheerleading, which is right in line with football and bicycling. Cheerleading isn't so much the pom-pom sport as it was 20 years ago. It's much more gymnastics now. But with the pyramids and the jumping and the flipping that they do, they experience as many concussions as the football players on the football field, which a lot of people don't realize. And then now this is just a number of head injuries that actually result in concussion. And as you can see, football is, right in line with a lot of the other sports, horseback riding being the largest. And this is where they're wearing a helmet and, fall off of a very high place, and sometimes at rapid speed. But as you can see, it's affecting every sport pretty much. And playground accidents are some of the most undetected concussions that happen. Because unless a teacher or a supervisor sees it happen, a lot of times it can go undetected. Swimming is another. They get hit in the lane or kicked while practicing, and they don't say anything. And since it's a non-contact sport, a lot of those injuries go undetected.
I think that's a good point that you just made, because before have been up till now talking a lot about contact sport, where there's actually a physical hit or a contact between two participants, but it doesn't have to be. It can simply be one person that just, as in falling off a horse, or I guess swimming into the side of the pool, or something that isn't meant to be a
backstrokers
contact
hit the side
sport.
a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So, and as I mentioned, many concussions go undiagnosed. And we're seeing this in the media a lot more now than ever, with a lot of, the lawsuits that are continuing to happen in the NFL. People like Muhammad Ali, once thought to have Parkinson's, which they believe he does, but it was onset by, punch drunk. I mean, being hit multiple times, subconcussive hits over, an elongated period of time. And this is affecting organizations, from the NFL all the way down to elementary schools. I mean, participation in some sports like football are down. I mean, and dramatically down. And some folks are now calling it an epidemic, especially in youth sports. In the higher level sports, there are rules and mandates that provide people like, trained professionals like Jim Buzzkirk to be at each game, and in a lot of cases at practice. But in youth sports, especially middle school and grade school, those aren't the same rules. And a lot of times it's just a mom or dad coaching a team, and hits to the head go undetected. And that's one of the reasons, we started the company Headcase, was to create a system that could watch or look for impact when mom and dad can't. And we try to document everything because, unfortunately, we do live in a litigious society, and the liabilities and legal risks of these injuries are dramatically increasing. And sports, one of the main things that, Jim and I agree upon is, sport for youth is paramount. We don't ever want to lose our ability to play sports and keep our kids active, but we've got to just do it in a safer manner. If you go to the next slide. So high school athletes, many people don't realize this, but I mean, they're still a child. They don't have a fully developed brain. So it does take longer for an athlete to recover from a concussion. And a lot of times their emotions and the side effects can be much more severe. And their brains really do not stop evolving. In a girl, I think it's 23, in a man, it's 25 or 26 till they're fully developed. And so injury to a non-fully developed brain can be extreme. And as this is indicating here, 53% of high school athletes have suffered a concussion prior to even playing high school athletics. So in grade school or middle school. And then college athletes, 36%, so 1/3 have had multiple concussions. I mean, that tells me right there, we've got a concussion problem in sports. And, that's why we're trying to do something about it. And so some of the symptoms, that can be assessed on the sideline using things like a SCAT test or a standardized concussion assessment test, when done by an individual like myself, would be a SCAT-2, and then done by a professional is a SCAT-3, which is the latest and greatest in SCAT symptom detection. But that has to be delivered by a trained professional like Jim. But some of the symptoms are headache, difficulty concentrating, dizziness, balance, sensitivity to light, a lot of the ones that you're probably familiar with, if you're familiar with TBI at all. Blurred vision, nausea, vomiting. If you see any of those type of symptoms, you've got a very, very good chance or percentage that individual has a concussive event or has had or sustained a concussive event. Could you go to the next slide?
Well, just before you do, Dan, one of the things that isn't on this list is loss of consciousness. And I think a lot of people assume that loss of consciousness is pretty much, associated with concussion.
Sure. I think that falls into the category of sign. These are symptoms, but I guess loss of consciousness is also a symptom.
But not necessarily.
Right, exactly. It doesn't.
Most concussions don't involve it, as I understand. Is that correct?
That is correct. You don't have to be knocked unconscious to have a concussion. However, most times people are knocked unconscious. They have a concussion, but one is not necessarily synonymous with the other. Being a former boxer, I'd been knocked out a few times and did not have a concussion. But the majority of the time, I did. So, and every time I've seen an athlete knocked out, they have had a concussion. But I've also seen a lot of concussions that did not, actually knock the athlete out. So that's sort of a misnomer. People think you have to be knocked out to have one, and that's not true. And now the most important is now treating that concussion. I'll turn this over to the professional, Jim.
Okay. First of all, just to clarify what you were just talking about between the two of you there, Betsy. Now with the labeling of concussive and mild traumatic head injury, every person who loses consciousness now has been diagnosed as having a concussion. Those two now, they are synonymous, but not the other way around. You can have a concussive injury without being knocked unconscious, but if you are knocked unconscious, by definition, you've sustained a concussive injury. So we label them by the Academy of Neurology guidelines these days in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and grade 4. Grade 1 being any reporting of symptoms, and I think Dan made the clarification, the difference between symptoms and signs. Symptom is what is reported by the person. Signs are the objective actual findings on test results. So that's the difference between those two. So when treating a sports concussion, we have to be careful not to put the cart before the horse. The first thing we have to do is actually recognize and diagnose it as being a concussive injury. So the first thing is to recognize it either by the symptoms reported or by the signs displayed by the person sustaining the injury. And then removing the player immediately from play, and that becomes the first and most critical part of concussive management. And we'll get to this in a further slide, I believe, but there are various rules now in place by almost every state, if not every state at this point, mandating that. I happen to be fortunate enough to be working at the professional level, at the AHL level, which is one level below the NHL level, but we follow the same guidelines that they do, and they just mandated this year that any participant displaying symptoms or signs has to be removed for the entirety of a 24-hour period. And that's a legal requirement now as well in most states. So the laws have now been implemented to enforce protection, and then the onus is on the recognition part by parents, coaches, participants, teammates, and healthcare professionals that may be there to enforce those rules and mandate that it be recognized and that the person be removed from participation at that point. The second part is an assessment of the concussion, which has to be done by a trained professional. and it can be a physician, it can be a nurse practitioner, it can be a multitude of different practitioners that are involved in this. But the person has to then be formally medically assessed, following evidence-based guidelines and testings that have been proven to show whether or not the person sustained a concussive head injury. And not only does it determine the existence of it, but we now can measure the magnitude of it. The third part of management is just the ongoing monitoring. I think it should be noted here that a lot of times the symptoms and signs also that are displayed after a mild traumatic brain injury or concussive injury can be delayed up to several hours or even several days beyond the actual injury itself. So the person may present initially just fine, and their signs and symptoms may present further down the road up to 3 to 4 days afterwards. So ongoing monitoring by parents, by coaches, by people around the person is really important and necessary. In the healthcare world, we obviously manage the person ongoing to monitor for signs and symptom changes while we are getting our baseline testings done to measure the magnitude of it, which then mandates or dictates what the treatment protocol is going to be, aside from the initial rest period of 4 to 5 days after an injury, where we want the person to just basically rest. We want the brain to rest and recover. And then there becomes, after that, a graduated return back to participation in life activities. Return to life certainly goes with return to sport, whereby we start to tax the brain again in non-sport related activities. If in fact we're talking about an athlete here, if we're talking about someone other than an athlete, then it's return back to life situation, including work, those kinds of things. And there's a graduated approach back towards, in the case of the young athlete, back to school, back to participation in homework, back to participation in gym class. All of those things have to be gradually returned based on the person's objective medical findings. So we can go to the next slide, please. There are various objective tests that we now know of. We saw a picture of one of these before, where there's imaging studies. The imaging studies, are almost always done at the emergency room setting. The question always has become, how necessary is it to get the person in for an immediate scan? There's varying reports in the medical literature even about that. It's always advisable to err on the side of caution and get a scan. We certainly don't want to expose any young person to any undue radiation, if at all necessary, or if at all questionable, but certainly there's a place for imaging studies. And they'll rule out things like skull fractures or bleeding inside the brain, which becomes much more serious, or a grade 4 concussive injury. In addition to the imaging studies, there's other, again, objective medical testing, including cognitive tests, postural stability testing on computerized posturography, vestibular and balance testings that can detect not only the presence of the concussion, but can measure the magnitude of it. And these become functional testings per se, and looking for neurometabolic changes that can occur with a concussive injury that can cause problems with cognition, postural stability, and other central brain function activities. Next slide, please. So we now have mandated progression steps that are to be followed after an injury is sustained. It's a 6-step progression, and we hope that each one progresses within 24 hours, but certainly that's an individualized thing depending on the person's signs and symptoms that are assessed on a daily basis. It's important that the athlete remains asymptomatic throughout each step before progressing on to the next one, meaning they can't have any signs or symptoms of their injury prior to progressing on. So as I stated earlier, the first 5 days is now mandated of no activity until asymptomatic at full rest, until their symptoms are fully gone and they feel perfectly fine when they're at rest. So often, again, this involves removing the person from their everyday life activities, whether it be school, work, whatever. Then we progress them back once they're asymptomatic to a little bit of graded exercise where we start to stress the brain, stress their function again, and see if it brings out any of their symptoms. Generally, after that, we get back to some sort of sport-specific exercise and increase their aerobic training, where we're increasing the load on the brain and on their cardiovascular system to see if they start to elicit any symptoms at all. If they're okay with all of that, as far as the athlete goes, we return him back to non-contact training drills with their team. And continue to progress their resistance training to increase their stress on their cardiovascular system. If that all goes okay, then they go back to full contact practice. And if that all goes okay, then they're able to return back to play. So that's the kind of the generalized progression that we use to progress an athlete back towards participation in their sport. We would follow those same guidelines for the non-athlete in returning him back to full participation in life. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we always watch for are symptom reproduction or symptom recurrence during that progression. We always like them to be totally asymptomatic before progressing on to the next one. And if anything is worsened, then we have to back up and keep them at the level prior to the one which elicited their symptoms until they're able to tolerate it and then move up to the next one.
We have to then also take into consideration not just going back to sport, but even going back to school and other kinds of, cognitive challenges, I guess, if you will.
Oh, absolutely. It's very important, especially in the young athletes, that, once they are able or feel like they're getting better, once we start to tax their brain, that may be just simply the fact that they're getting up, going through their daily routine, and getting on a bus, riding to school, attending their classes, trying to listen to the teachers, get their assignments for the day and bring them home. That's a huge taxing activity to the brain itself. And a lot of times we have to grade that a little bit or graduate that a little bit, where they'll go back to school for just a couple hours a day and then maybe a half a day and then maybe 3/4 of a day and progress back to a full day's work. I know that at least in my company's involvement, we actually become the third-party liaison between the recovering athlete and their professors and teachers and whoever it is at school to let them know that there's an injury, that they need to have some graduation back towards their full activities, that the teachers may have to give them a little extra time to complete their assignments. They may have to hold off on giving them a ton of homework and not bury them with homework. One of the things we always worry about is the athlete who returns back to school finally after missing a week and suddenly gets 2 weeks worth of homework that they have to complete, within the next couple of days. And a lot of times the teachers don't recognize that. And I don't want to say that they're unsympathetic towards it, but I think it's more that they just aren't aware of it. And so we have to often intervene and educate the educators a little bit that they're going to have to gradually progress the person back into a full day's schoolwork with their homework and whatnot. So that all becomes part of the return to participation protocol that everyone has to be on the same page. Parents, participants, educators, coaches, et cetera. Everybody has to be on the same page. So education and communication among everyone is really key in managing the person once they get back towards progressing back towards life activities.
Well, we do have a number of educators on the webinar today, as usual, and so these are some of the ways that you talked about integrating them back into school. Is there any, if a teacher were to say, well, how long should I expect it to take? How long is this less homework, less stress going to last? There's probably no good answer to that, but how would you answer that for a
Sure.
teacher?
Well, there are good and not good answers to that. The good answer is we have a protocol that we're supposed to follow. And the protocol mandates that, the person be removed until they are totally asymptomatic with no signs or symptoms for 5 consecutive days. So that means if the person starts to feel better on day 3, but then on day 4 has a recurrence of their symptoms, they have to start all over again. So they have to be totally at rest, asymptomatic for 5 consecutive days before returning back to participation at all. That's mandated by the protocol now by the Academy of Neurology. So, that's a hard, fast number of 5 consecutive days. Now, everyone also is, having said that, everyone's a little bit different because it may take one person 5 days to recover and it may take another person 7 days to recover. Everyone is a little bit different, and that's why they have to be managed ongoing to monitor their signs and symptoms along the way. And they're, therefore the teachers that you questioned, they have to be aware that the person is coming back after sustaining an injury. They've been totally removed from everything for 5 consecutive days. So that means no television, no iPods, no listening to their music, no playing video games, no any of those things. We always recommend. We want to totally shut down their brain for 5 consecutive days. At that point, the medical literature reports that there is a so-called, in quotations, sweet spot that everybody has, that at that point we actually do want to turn the brain back on again. We want to challenge the brain. We want to exercise the brain, as it were, and start to progress the person back towards everyday life. We now know that if we don't do that and we procrastinate and we let the person protractedly rest without any activity, we actually end up doing the person more harm than good in that it delays their recovery. So there's a period of rest for 5 days that's mandated, and then we want to actually turn the person back on. The hard part in the medical world is how much do we turn that particular person back on, because everyone's different. And so we have to monitor them every day for their signs and symptoms to see what they can tolerate and what they can't, and then progressively progress them back to life activities, including school. All right, back to the next slide. Thank you. I alluded in the past that there's state laws now regarding this. It's in all 50 states, at least in some capacity, including the District of Columbia and Washington, D.C. We have to educate our coaches, parents, and athletes to these state laws and to these mandated protocols that are being implemented. Everyone has to be made aware of them. There are various organizations out there now working very hard to educate everybody and spread the word that these things do exist.
Jim
as far
and Dan,
as
one of the issues that one of our participants raised is that many youth sports leagues do not actually have trained staff, either identifying or on the back end, helping figure out when a player can actually return to play and to school. Do you have any suggestions for that kind of situation?
Yeah, I will speak to that. I'm sure Dan wants to put in some words to that effect as well. Now, it has become much more structured and much more of a process that everyone has to be made aware of. Okay, that's number one. Education is the key here, that everyone has to be made aware that these laws and protocols exist. Now, that's happening quickly, but it still isn't where everyone wants it to be. So anyone who's going to participate in a sport ultimately is going to have to be made aware of what their responsibilities are in regards to these types of issues. So the leagues themselves are now being educated and made aware of what their legal liabilities and ramifications are towards these laws and protocols and how they're enforced. Most leagues now are mandating that coaches, parents, participants, team managers, whatever they are, have to participate in some sort of an awareness program, an educational program that's offered by the league or by the school or whatever organization it is that the athlete is participating for. But it has now become the responsibility of each person involved in the sports world to be aware of what their rights, responsibilities, and limits of liability are in regards to these protocols. Dan, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it was sort of a two-part question, and one was, what about schools that don't have, tools or trained professionals? That's one of the areas that, we created Headcase for, was to provide some of these tools and put them in the hands of mom and dad and or the coach who coaches Little League or Pee Wee football, so that they do have access to sideline assessment tools, so they do have access to signs and symptoms that would potentially identify a concussion. But Jim was spot on with, if you do have signs or symptoms of a concussion, that athlete absolutely should seek medical attention immediately, and that being a physician. And so, almost every town in America has physicians, and they're the ones really who are responsible for setting that protocol and to follow that and then work with the parents. The parents have to take responsibility here and get involved. The days of just taking your son or daughter to a sport and dropping them off and, sort of having football or baseball be your babysitter, I would highly recommend you not participate in sports if that's going to be your attitude. Parents have to play a crucial role in keeping your kids safe. It's as simple as that.
And I think just one. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
I was just saying, but you're spot on with education and awareness. We're trying, through the Headcase website, through some of our blogs and what we do on social media to educate and make people aware of state laws, make them aware of standardized protocols, the 5-day rule, when in doubt, pull them out, and things of that nature, because it's absolutely crucial. The more we know, the more we know, the more we can keep our kids safe. Jim?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Betsy, I'm not sure that I fully answered your question, and Dan, you said it correctly. That's a two-part question, and that is for the program that does not have any healthcare practitioners available to that particular organization, who then bears the responsibility to carry out these laws and protocols. And in every case now, it is the actual coach of the team. The coach is put on the hot seat by these protocols and by these laws. And so the parent who volunteers to be the team coach has to be made aware that they then bear that responsibility, both legally and morally and ethically, to uphold the laws and the protocols that are now being enforced. So the coach who says, well, I didn't know, that's not acceptable anymore, because the person who takes that job as a coach has to be aware of the responsibilities that now come with that. So in the absence of a healthcare practitioner, the coach becomes the gatekeeper.
Sounds
legally.
like a pretty terrific responsibility.
It's the days, like Dan said, the days of just wanting to be the volunteer coach for your youth sport team has totally changed now. And along with that come the responsibilities and legal liabilities associated with that position.
Okay, so you started to talk about the protocol, and so if I am now deciding, my kids have outgrown it, but if I decide I wanted to coach my granddaughter's t-ball team, and she's only one, so she's not playing that yet. But you and Dan and I talked the other day about the best practices, protocol that includes baseline testing, assessment at the field and Rink-side, so maybe you guys can just walk through this. We only have just a few more minutes, but I'd like to give people at least a sense of what is expected now.
Sure, and I'll address it from the healthcare side of things. Baseline testing has now become kind of the gold standard. And there are various opinions and there are various tools out there that are being utilized these days as to what should be included in a baseline test. But I think everyone certainly recognizes the need and the value of getting a baseline pre-injury, pre-participation baseline assessment of every athlete in some capacity, so that we do have something to compare to, should an injury occur. Dan alluded to the field or Rink-side real-time assessment tools. The SCAT-3 is the medical one that's the gold standard now. The SCAT-2 is the non-medical application of that. And then the recognition of the injury and then getting the person to a qualified healthcare practitioner is the key to that whole thing. The post-injury assessment then is done by the healthcare practitioner. If there's a baseline testing that was available, that comparison is invaluable in determining what changed from the incident. And then that also gives us the baseline that we want to get the person back to prior to their returning back to participation, involving their post-injury rehabilitation.
That's really important. And Dan, can you talk a little bit about that, what's happening at the field or the Rink-side, when that real-time issue occurs?
Sure. What Headcase has done, and Headcase is a combination of software and in-helmet sensor, as well as a built-in SCAT-2 and SCAT-3 test into a mobile app. And what we've tried to do here is monitor all the impacts that an athlete takes, both linear and angular, as well as if there's an injury or there's a hit in question, to be able to test that athlete at the Rink-side or field side immediately using a SCAT-2 or SCAT-3 sports concussion assessment test, and then determining whether that person is showing signs or symptoms of a concussion, and then getting them the help they need immediately. And what Headcase is doing is not only helping facilitate getting that athlete the help, but then documenting all of that in the cloud, where we can load, an athlete's baseline tests if they have multiple, and I usually recommend that they do have multiple because there are different tests that test for different things. Then, all of the impacts, then the sideline tests, that the answers and the questions that are asked, it's crucial to correlate those back to the data. And then, of course, the protocol that is set for the recovery of the athlete, and then the post-injury testing can all be saved in one place for the history of the athlete. So if there are issues later, if that athlete has a second concussion a year later or even 6 months later, and now a doctor or a physician, a trainer or even a coach has a record to go back to look at and see what happened in the previous incident. And again, it's all about liability and protecting the coach, the parent, the organization, and most importantly, the athlete.
So we've sort of eaten through all of our time and I think we could talk for a long time, and there are a lot more topics. There's some questions that have come up that I don't think we're going to have time, unless you guys are willing to spend a few more minutes. I know you've got very busy schedules, so probably should wrap up, and maybe there are some questions that we can answer offline and get back to people on that. But obviously, this is all about encouraging safe play. You commented before. I don't want people to leave and say, "Oh, the kids should never play sports," because obviously that physical activity and being healthy, certainly go together. So let me give you an opportunity to sort of sum up and talk about where we are and your recommendations and thoughts about how we encourage our children to play sports, but to do it in a way that's as safe as possible.
Well, that's exactly right. We just want kids to play safely. Follow the rules. Do what you're told. We're teaching the right tackling techniques and checking techniques, and the whole heads-up movement in sports, which started with the NFL, is excellent. It's teaching the right techniques to athletes so that they play the game safer. And there are rules and regulation changes that are happening in soccer, in baseball, in basketball, all to protect an athlete's head. But again, it's all about education and awareness. So all of us who are involved in sport and understand what those rules and regulation changes are, I believe it's our responsibility to pass that information on and make sure that not only the athletes know, but their parents know. And that's the only way we're going to, do our best to eradicate something like second hit syndrome, because concussions will happen. We do want to, dramatically reduce them, but I don't think we'll ever alleviate them. And, Jim, do you have anything to comment on that as well?
Well, I would just say as technology continues to improve, as our educational processes continue to improve, we're gaining ground on how to better manage this entire problem of head injury, mild traumatic brain injury, and concussion. I think there are more and more people getting involved in it, and the word is spreading across, from the grassroots level all the way up through the ranks of how sport will continue to evolve to ultimately protect athletes from potential long-term effect injuries.
Right. Well, this has been wonderful. I've learned some things today, and I hope all of our attendees have also felt that this was gave them some insights into this field. There's so much discussion about it. It's sometimes hard to know what's right and what's not right. So you've definitely, Dan and Jim, clarified some things for all of us, and I think really got us all at the state where we're going to be paying a lot more attention to this and to all of our children participating in sports perhaps than we have in the past. So I want to thank you very, very much for your time today, for joining us and sharing your expertise and insights with our audience.
It's been my pleasure, Betsy. Thank you for the opportunity. I actually am available for a few more minutes to entertain some questions afterwards if anybody wants that, for anything that I can assist with.
Okay. All right. Well, there were a couple of questions, one of which had to do I think actually both of them had to do with post-concussion treatment. One of them had to do with if there are persistent headaches. You said that you want them to be asymptomatic, but are there times when there are headaches or migraines or some form of headache that persists? And is that a different situation, or what can you share with us about that?
Sure. Headache number one is the number one post-concussive complaint, actually. And it looks a whole lot like migraine, but it's not actually migraine. It is an actual post-traumatic headache. It's officially called now. It's managed very similarly to migraine headache, and is certainly a big problem with most concussive head injuries. So that all becomes part of the process of getting the person to a trained healthcare practitioner, in this case, obviously a physician who would manage the headache with medication. And it does need to be controlled. Headache has to be fully resolved. Headache has to be, totally controlled and gone before the person can progress back to activity. Okay.
Another question has to do with monitoring sleep. I remember when my kids were little, I was told that if they had a concussion, I was supposed to wake them up or go. I think I had to wake them up periodically. Is that still something that is current practice, or what do we worry about there?
Yeah. So the only thing that we worry about there is the person who has a bleed inside the brain. If that person goes to sleep, there's a likelihood that the person will never wake up. So we always monitor them closely within the first several hours after the initial injury, and here's where the brain scan or the imaging studies that we alluded to come into play. If there's any suspicion of anything beyond, the what I'll call the norm findings after a concussive head injury, and that I have to put that in quotations because there really is no such thing. Everyone's a little different, but the things that we always look out for, if there's any advancement of their signs or symptoms, especially things like GI irritation, nausea, vomiting, those kinds of things, it almost always mandates a head scan be performed to make sure that there's no bleeding inside the brain. Once we've determined that there is no bleeding inside the brain or that there's no hemorrhaging or anything that could be potentially life-threatening, then sleep, it does not have to be interrupted. The person is allowed to sleep. So there's where we would encourage everyone to go ahead and get a head scan, or at least be evaluated by a trained professional before they actually go to sleep.
That sounds like
sleep is another big problem with a head injury. Usually it's one of two things. Either the person has lack of sleep and has difficulty either falling or staying asleep, or they become very somnolent and all they want to do is sleep. And so, monitoring their sleep and regulating their sleep becomes another problem for the healthcare practitioner that needs to be addressed.
So it's not just that the class is boring and that their kids are falling asleep. Maybe there's another reason.
Well, there may be some of that too, but there may be another reason.
All right. Well, those were the other questions that had come up, and I thank you for taking a couple of extra minutes to do that. So again,
no
I just want to
problem.
thank you for your great insights and information, Dan and Jim, and maybe we'll have time for you to come back another time because I think there are probably a lot of unanswered questions still and a fascinating topic area. So thank you again.
Anytime.
Thank you for allowing us to participate, and certainly I won't speak for Dan, but for myself, you were kind enough to provide my email address, and if anybody has specific questions, feel free to fire those out to my email, and I'll be happy to answer them.
Same here, absolutely. Please feel free to reach out or visit our website at headcasecompany.com.
Wonderful. Well, to all of our attendees today, this is our last Neuroscience and Education webinar of the 2014 year, and we will look forward to doing some new topics next year. We hope everybody has a wonderful and safe and concussion-free holiday season. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.